That shooting happened almost 2 years ago.
And the WSBT 22 Suzanne Spencer has been following this story. She joins us live outside the St. Joseph County Courthouse tonight. And Suzanne, this is the 7th out of 8 charged in this connection to this.
A jury already convicted Robert Griffin last year. He was the trigger man and will serve 60 years in jail. Police found a bullet in the baby's body that matched the bullet type in the gun that he fired. Now the question becomes, who brought that gun to the park and what kind of consequences should they face? The prosecution says it was Bradbury. They say he allegedly brought the gun, which aided or caused Robert Griffin to kill SWOVELAND. But the defense is saying Bradbury had no intention of killing anyone that day and even tried to stop Griffin when he saw the gun. Bradbury was one of several men who allegedly showed up to fight at Coquillard Park in April 2014. Police said Griffin was trying to shoot at another guy, but it missed him and hit SWOVELAND, who was playing in a relative's front yard nearly 390 yards away. Now, of course, all of this comes down to a little boy who died in that relative's front yard. Jurors saw an autopsy photo of that young child, and another relative of John SWOVELAND Jr. has been in every single court proceeding since day one of all of these different juries. Now, those jurors, of course, through all of these different trials have heard lots of witnesses. They heard 8 alone in Bradbury's trial today. Hear what they had to hear and all that they saw coming up tonight at 6. Live in South Bend, Suzanne Spencer, WSBT 22 News.
WSBT 22 Suzanne Spencer is live outside the St. Joseph County Courthouse tonight. And Suzanne, the question is now, who brought that gun to the park?
And should they be charged with murder, Rick? The prosecution has brought in at least 9 witnesses so far just today, but also in that courtroom is the great aunt of John SWOVELAND Jr. She's been at every single court proceeding since all of this started nearly 2 years ago. Bradbury is the 7th of 8 people to go before a judge charged in connection to SWOVELAND's death. The 2-year-old was gunned down in his aunt's front yard on Campo Street in 2014. A jury convicted Robert Griffin of being the trigger man in February 2015. Police said a bullet from a gun that he used matched the bullet found in the child's body. Now prosecutors are pointing their finger toward Bradbury, saying he brought the gun to the park and should be convicted of murder because he caused Griffin to shoot the gun that killed SWOVELAND. In opening statements, Deputy Prosecutor Chris Frank said Bradbury confessed to police days after the shooting that he took responsibility. Quote, "If I wouldn't have been there with that gun, that kid wouldn't have died," Deputy Prosecutor Chris Frank said Bradbury told police, but the defense said Bradbury had no intention of killing anyone that day. Quote, "Tyre believed he was going there for a fist fight," Bradbury's lawyer told the jury. "I also just stepped out of court." We'd heard again from at least 9 witnesses so far today. It's still ongoing. Many of those witnesses are also the same men charged and some of them convicted in connection to SWOVELAND's death. Now, this specific trial, though, is expected to last through the week. Live in South Bend, Suzanne Spencer, WSBT 22 News.
On WSBT 22, Suzanne Spencer is live outside the St. Joseph County Courthouse tonight. And Suzanne, all of this boils down to who brought the gun that killed SWOVELAND to that local park.
And should they face consequences, Rick? The prosecution said Bradbury brought the murder weapon and a shotgun. They alleged that aided the trigger man, Robert Griffin. Now, the defense saying that no one intended to kill the toddler and that, of course, they argue Bradbury even tried to stop the shooting from happening. SWOVELAND was killed outside his aunt's home on Campo Street nearly 2 years ago. Police said a gang fight led to that shooting. Robert Griffin, the trigger man, was convicted of murder last February. The prosecution argued Griffin used a gun that Bradbury brought to the park. Other witnesses said Bradbury had a shotgun but didn't use it. 3 jailhouse inmates testified today. They told the jury about interactions they had with Bradbury. Terrence Peterson told the judge he said if he would never have brought the guns over, it never would have happened. One of those inmates mentioned a .38 revolver, the gun that police say is linked to SWOVELAND's death. The prosecution trying to prove Bradbury's connection to that gun. Jurors also heard a 3-hour-long video interrogation between Bradbury and police.
Did you think the 3 hours of him kind of changing his story helped your case?
It's hard to say. It's It's an unusual situation. It's very difficult for everybody involved, including Tyre, who was 15 years old at the time that this happened.
Throughout this trial, Tyre Bradbury's been very active, looking around the courtroom at his family, at all the witnesses coming in through those doors. But of course, the police acknowledging more than once that there shouldn't be any communication between the defendant and all the witnesses and those inside the courtroom. Now, the last piece of evidence that the jury heard was a nearly 3-hour-long video interrogation between Bradbury and police in which he shouted, was punching the walls. We'll tell you more about what happened in that interrogation tonight at 6. Live in South Bend, Suzanne Spencer, WSBT 22 News.
WSBT 22 Suzanne Spencer is live outside the St. Joseph County Courthouse right now. And Suzanne, the state and defense now preparing their closing arguments.
They'll be hearing those closing arguments starting tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning. This comes after nearly 16 witnesses have taken the stand over 2 days of testimony. But the last piece of evidence that the jury heard today was a 3.5-hour video recorded confession a video recorded interrogation between Bradbury and police. Bradbury told his mother in the interrogation room, "Everything happened because of me." The prosecution says Bradbury brought a shotgun and the gun that killed SWOVELAND to Coquillard Park in April 2014. Robert Griffin used that gun when he fired at a member of a rival gang, but instead missed and hit SWOVELAND. The prosecution says without Bradbury bringing those guns to the park, a baby would still be alive. But the defense says Bradbury showed up with no intention of killing anyone. They argue Bradbury even tried to prevent Griffin from shooting. In that video interrogation, Bradbury told police, "I had a .380 caliber pistol." Detective Cook responded, "You had a .380 caliber pistol. What did you do with it?" He responded, "I threw it." Later on, Bradbury said, "I had a shotgun." Detective Cook asked, "I thought you had a .38. He responded, "I had the shotgun and the .38. And later on, Detective Cook asked, "Who shot the .38 that you're trying to protect?" Bradbury's mom intervened, saying, "You need to tell him." Detective Cook said, "Did you really shoot that .38? Bradbury said, "No, I felt like it was my fault from the beginning." Bradbury told the judge he didn't want to testify on his own behalf.
Tyre had just spent several hours testifying on his own through a videotape that was played of his earlier interviews, and he decided that that was sufficient and that he would relax and let the state prove their case rather than getting up there and testifying.
Well, now, Suzanne, Bradbury was very emotional in that interrogation video.
About 2/3 of the way through that interrogation video, Rick, he erupted in anger. He basically wiped an entire table full of items off onto the floor. He was screaming, shouting, and even punched some of the walls while no one else was in there.
And how is Bradbury reacting now in the courtroom?
He's been pretty alert during all of this. He's been turning around as different witnesses have come into the courtroom, exchanging glances with some of his family members who have also been in there, which has really caught the attention of some of the guards in there because, of course, that behavior between the defendant and people in the courtroom isn't allowed.
All right, Suzanne, I know you'll be back in the courtroom tomorrow. Thank you for that live report tonight.
WSBT 22 Suzanne Spencer is waiting on that verdict to come down. And Suzanne, what have you heard so far? What are you hearing?
Jennifer, really not much of anything. We're about 4 hours into deliberations, and so far, really all that we've seen was the jury come out for a break about 2 hours and 50 minutes into their deliberations. But other than that, we're told they haven't really asked many questions of the prosecution and defense. This comes, of course, after the prosecution and defense spent about an hour and a half on closing arguments earlier today. All along, the prosecution has argued Tyre Bradbury is linked to the murder weapon. But the defense argued back, saying there's no evidence Bradbury had the gun or even gave it to the trigger man, Robert Griffin. The jury heard from at least 16 witnesses this week. They also heard a 3.5-hour video interrogation between Bradbury and police. In that interview, Bradbury said, "It's all my fault. If I hadn't been at the park, this wouldn't have happened." But the defense said that quote is a seductive statement and that Bradbury had taken some sort of responsibility for his actions. I'm, of course, headed back into the courtroom here shortly, where, again, we'll be waiting as long as it takes until this verdict comes down in the murder trial for Tyre Bradbury. Live in South Bend, Suzanne Spencer, WSBT 22 News.
On the WSBT 22, Suzanne Spencer has been covering this all week long. And Suzanne, we're hearing that verdict is in now.
We are, after nearly 5 hours of deliberations, Rick, we're headed back into the courtroom shortly to hear exactly what that verdict is. But this, of course, comes after the prosecutor and the defense have been hard at work all week on much of their interrogations and all sorts of things. Now, jurors have to decide if bringing a gun to the South Bend park is enough to convict Bradbury of murder. Prosecutors said Bradbury brought the .38 that Robert Griffin used to fire the fatal shots and therefore aided in his murder. But witnesses said Bradbury tried to stop the shooting from happening. In that interrogation, Bradbury didn't tell police anything about stopping that shooting, just the witnesses did. Through 3 days of testimony, the prosecution pointed to statements linking Bradbury to the lethal gun. In one point, he said, quote, "I had the shotgun and the .38. In another, he said, quote, "It's all my fault." In another, he said, "Instead of Larry, a little kid died." But the defense tried poking holes in that argument, saying there's no proof that Bradbury ever took that gun from a friend's house or gave it to the trigger man. Bradbury's defense attorney said, quote, "There's no evidence Tyre broke into his house and went over there and gave the gun to Griffin. We have nothing." Now, the jury has a very tough decision before you. As we told you, they have reached that decision. We're headed back into the courthouse again because they have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Bradbury brought that gun to the park with the intent to kill when he handed it over to the trigger man. They also have to prove he essentially caused the trigger man to kill SWOVELAND when he handed over that gun.
And Suzanne, let me ask you, what's Bradbury's demeanor been like in the courtroom through all this?
Throughout this, he's really been very attentive in the courtroom, looking around at his family and friends who have been there throughout much of this trial, and also looking at various witnesses who have come into the courtroom. Of course, there have been several people in that courtroom as well, including some relatives of John SWOVELAND Jr., who have been there throughout the past 7 cases associated with SWOVELAND's death.
All right, Suzanne Spencer tonight live in South Bend, and we're waiting that verdict, Suzanne. Thank you so much. Now, WSBT 22 Suzanne Spencer just stepped out of the courtroom. Suzanne, even though there's a verdict, this trial's not over yet. Jurors already hearing more testimony.
That's because, in addition, Tyre Bradbury was charged with criminal gang enhancement, a charge that could take add many years to his sentencing. This is a charge that many of the guys in this case related to SWOVELAND's death were charged with right after the fact. Tensions were high, though, as the judge read the guilty verdict for Tyre Bradbury's role in John SWOVELAND Jr.'s death. The judge asked each juror to tell their court each of their decision. As they each said guilty, Bradbury leaned back in his chair, shook his head. Shortly after, some of his family members walked into the rotunda in tears. But as soon as the judge read that verdict, she told the jury there's another trial. Under Indiana law, she couldn't tell them about the gang enhancement charge until that verdict was read.
And Suzanne, a whole new trial begins.
Starting right now, Rick. In fact, the state is calling 3 witnesses to the stand, civilian witnesses, as we speak. Patrick Roth is in there listening to that right now. And of course, depending on that goes, the court could be hearing all of this testimony well into the night and also into tomorrow. But at this point, it's too early to say.
And Suzanne, all of this stemming from that one incident at Coquiller Park.
That's right. All of this comes down to one question, and attorneys have been wrestling that as well as the jurors did. Who brought the gun, and should they be convicted of John SWOVELAND Jr.'s death? But this trial really raises a lot of new questions about these guys' potential criminal involvement, especially stemming back to that day, and also just raises a lot of new questions that we'll soon learn the answer to. And again, Patrick Roth is in the courtroom right now. I'm headed back to go back in there along with a few photographers as we continue to learn more about this developing story.
Of course, we'll have all those updates coming up later this evening at 11 o'clock as well. Suzanne, thank you.
WSBT 22's Suzanne Spencer is live outside the courthouse in South Bend. So, Suzanne, what exactly does all of this mean?
It means his sentence could essentially be doubled to 130 years in prison. As the judge read that guilty verdict, Bradbury drooped his head, and she also acknowledged to the jury that they had a Herculean effort on behalf of all of their work that they've put forth over the past week. But earlier today, 4 people were escorted out of the courtroom for their behavior Our cameras are rolling when this man, Bruce Butler Jr., was arrested outside the courtroom. The police inside noticed he was making hand signals with a witness on the stand who was also previously charged in connection with SWOVELAND's death. Our photographer heard Butler yelling expletives outside the courtroom, and that's when he was taken to jail by sheriff's deputies. He was charged this afternoon with resisting law enforcement. Malcolm Buchanan was also escorted but not arrested. He was also previously charged in connection to SWOVELAND's death. Now, the jury had to decide what a criminal gang is and if Tyre was part of a gang when SWOVELAND died. Today, prosecutors pointed towards several Facebook posts showing different photos and also hand signals. And a South Bend police expert also took the stand who specializes in gangs and other associations. But the defense maintained throughout all of this was not a gang, it was merely a group of friends.
All right, Suzanne, so how much more time are we looking at? How much more time could Bradbury face with this conviction?
Under the murder conviction, he could see up to 65 years just for the for the murder conviction alone, but that could essentially double under this now criminal gang enhancement charge. But of course, all of that will come at sentencing set for April. Now, we're putting together a reaction from this verdict over the past week of both Bradbury's family, SWOVELAND's family, and also police detectives who have been working this case ever since this happened nearly 2 years ago. And that'll be for you tonight at 6.
All right, we look forward to that. Thank you very much, Suzanne. WSBT 22's Suzanne Spencer has been following this all week long. Suzanne, Bradbury now facing 130 years in jail.
65 years for the murder conviction and another 65 years for criminal gang enhancement. But all of this boils down to a 2-year-old boy, John SWOVELAND Jr., who was gunned down while playing outside his relative's home. Bradbury drooped his head inside the courtroom for both verdicts. His family been there through all of this, and so has SWOVELAND's family. The judge said this decision was a Herculean effort on behalf of the jury, who spent 4 days listening to testimony, heard from at least 20 witnesses throughout the week. Bradbury was 7th of 8 teens that were charged in connection to SWOVELAND's death. SWOVELAND's great aunt has sat through every single court proceeding from the beginning.
There's a little boy named Anthony. Won't have his brother ever, because they took him.
Justice for John would have been for him to grow up and have a chance to be something in his life, but unfortunately this is what we're left with in the aftermath of a horrible incident. It's gratifying that the jury worked so hard on this. You know, it's a lot of work by Metro Homicide, South Bend PD.
Tyre Bradbury was a 15-year-old kid. Certainly his own worst enemy as far as the statements that he's made, but still a 15-year-old kid with everything that goes along with that.
Bradbury's family told me after court today he's not guilty of murder and he's not guilty of being in a gang. They said everything that happened here over the past week is far from the truth.
Well, you look at the verdicts as they came down. A lot happened inside the courtroom today as well.
4 men were actually escorted outside of the courtroom in proceedings just alone today. Our cameras were actually rolling when this man, Bruce Butler Jr., was escorted out of the courtroom. That's because guards inside saw him signaling at a witness on the stand who was also previously charged in connection to SWOVELAND's death. When he got into the hall, he yelled expletives at police and they took him to jail. He was later charged with resisting law enforcement. Another man, Malcolm Buchanan, also convicted in connection to SWOVELAND's death, was taken out but not arrested.
All right, Suzanne, back to Bradbury for just a minute and sentencing. Looking ahead to that, he'll be up for sentencing in less than a month.
Right, and that's when we'll really learn exactly how many years he'll spend in prison. He'll face at least 65 for the murder conviction alone, but that criminal gang enhancement will virtually double whatever he gets on that murder conviction. So at most, it could be 130 years in prison for him.
All right, Suzanne, live in downtown South Bend for us tonight. Thanks very much.